morning, everybody. I'm Cliff May. I'm the president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I want to welcome you this morning. Obviously, this is quite timely. I think most of you are familiar with our organization. For those who are not, we're a policy institute. We represent a range of views. Well, I think there are certain things we all agree on, certain parameters. Among the things I think we all agree on here is that human rights are deserved by everybody, including freedom of speech, freedom of worship. We're opposed to discrimination on the basis of religion, on the basis of race, creed, orientation. We believe democratic societies have a right to defend themselves and probably an obligation to defend one another. As I say, this is timely. The events over the weekend are still somewhat murky. I'm just learning that some of the numbers we've seen may not be as clear as we thought. I'm pleased to have with us two of my colleagues here at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Kyrie Abaza and John Hanna. Also, we're pleased to have Steve Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations and Oren Kessler, Tel Aviv-based journalist. And with that, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John to moderate and bring some clarity to the situation. Thank you.
Let's hope. We can all hope. Thank you, Cliff. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Again, let me welcome you to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I'm John Hanna. I'm a senior fellow here at FDD. Very pleased to be moderating this panel today. As Cliff said, it's very, very timely. And even as the smoke begins to clear from this weekend's second round of presidential elections, at least it's evident to me. I'm anxious to hear what the panel has to say, that what many of us had hoped for months ago, that this might be the moment when the turmoil and chaos of Egypt's immediate post-revolutionary phase begins to fade, and we finally begin to see something approaching the start of a democratic transition. It seems to me that is not in the cards. Simply not going to happen, at least not now. Instead, in light of the extraordinary events of the past 4 or 5 days, including in particular what appears to be the full-blown counter-revolutionary surge of the SCAF and the old order, it's clear that we have simply been launched into a new phase of this long-simmering crisis and struggle, one that looks like it could go on for quite some time with very uncertain, potentially dangerous consequences for Egypt, the United States, and the Middle East. Dissolution of the Islamist-dominated parliament last week, and at least I thought until this morning, perhaps the Constituent Assembly that it had named, the apparent victory this weekend, at least I thought, of the Muslim Brotherhood candidate Mohamed Morsi, and yesterday's quite brazen declaration by the SCAF granting itself sweeping new powers, including allegedly over the drafting of a new constitution. All of these seem a tailor-made recipe for intensifying confrontation, long-term political instability perhaps, and even violence at some point. All the while, of course, as the world's attention remains very much focused on these political dramas in Cairo, the alarming crumbling of the Egyptian state looks set to continue apace with no obvious end in sight, including growing levels of crime and lawlessness, a very anemic economy that offers very few prospects for achieving even minimally necessary levels of growth, and parts of the country, such as the Western Desert, the border with Sudan, and the Sinai, looking more and more like they are turning into ungoverned spaces. All of this, of course, seems like very bad news for the United States, Israel, and the West. 16 months ago, I think it was still possible to believe that we'd really dodged a bullet in Egypt. Our ally, the aging but sclerotic dictator Mubarak, had been quickly dispatched, but left in control of Egypt's transition was the Egyptian military. Its prestige and credibility largely intact, and with whom the United States and Israel shared very, very close relations. All in all, if you'd drawn up a scenario, this was not a bad one, which we might finally begin to see the emergence of essential political and economic reforms, however gradually, take place in Egypt without jeopardizing Egypt's basic strategic orientation toward the United States, Israel, and the Camp David Accords. Alas, I think that those hopes, too, now have largely passed away, dashed by events like raids against American NGOs, assaults on foreign embassies, unilateral abrogation of the gas treaty with Israel. But first and foremost, it has to be said, dashed by the sheer incompetence, venality, and narrow-mindedness of the SCAF and other elements of the ancien regime, with a healthy assist, it must also be said, from the untethered ambition and, frankly, the widespread popularity of the Muslim Brothers, and even worse, the Salafists movement, and the near-total disarray and lack of seriousness for what passes for Egypt's non-Islamist opposition, including, I fear, the so-called revolutionary youth. So what to make of this mess, where it's likely to lead, and what, if anything, the United States might do to mitigate the worst from happening is the subject of our panel this morning. To help us begin to sort through these questions, I'm very pleased to be joined by a stellar group of experts that bring a wide variety of perspectives to the table. I think you all do have a copy of their bios. Cliff has done a brief introduction. Let me just expand it a little bit. First up, we're going to have my tremendous colleague here at FDD, Hairi Abaza. As many of you know, Hairi spent a decade working at the highest levels of the WAFD party in Egypt, and he's without question, I think, one of the most astute and well-plugged-in analysts of modern Egyptian politics. Hairi, over the last year, has spent a lot of time on the ground in Egypt, maintains terrific sources throughout the country, and I know that I personally have benefited enormously from his insights and wisdom over the past year. Following Hairi will be Oren Kessler, a Tel Aviv-based journalist, as Cliff has said, who was formerly the Middle East Affairs correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, and he's also worked at the prestigious Israeli daily Haaretz. Oren has published widely on the dramatic events that have engulfed the Arab world since 2011, and importantly, how they are being viewed in Israel. And we very much look forward to hearing from Oren today. And last up will be Steve Cook, who's an old friend, and for much of the past decade has been one of Washington's leading authorities on the Middle East and Egypt specifically. Steve's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and just published a very, very important and well-timed book, The Struggle for Egypt from Nasser to Tahrir Square, which I would heartily recommend to everybody, especially an audience like this that's interested in Egypt. The way it'll work is that each of our panelists will make a few minutes of introductory remarks. I'll then ask a few questions to get the conversation going, and then we'll turn it over to you in the audience for Q&A. I'd remind you, we do, as obvious, the cameras, the tapes are rolling, and the session is going to be very much on the record. So with that, let me turn it over to Hairi.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for being here and coming to FDD. We are starting this panel with is it better? No, okay, sorry. Yeah, we are starting today this panel without actually knowing the final results, but what we know for sure is that it's almost a 50-50 divide in this election. Mohamed Morsi and his campaign claimed victory with 52%, whereas the Shafiq campaign says it's too early to claim victory, and there are still some complaints that need to be reviewed, and also not all the ballot boxes were. But in any case, whoever is going to win knows that he's winning with few votes, because more than most, about half registered voters did not vote, and also in a highly divided and fragmented country. Also, whoever will be elected will have to govern with the military, and the transfer of power to a civilian rule will not actually happen according to what some have wished for. And the army just issued a constitutional declaration in which it will hold on to the legislative powers, to the budget, until a constitution is drafted and until a new parliament is elected according to the new constitution. Of course, the military said that it regrets the dissolution of the parliament, the court order, and that it considered the previous election, the legislative election, as being their greatest achievement, and that they will not create a new constituent assembly unless if courts dissolve the current constituent assembly. So of course now the courts are very useful to the military. This regime, I mean, to look at the nature of Egyptian politics, we have to remember that this regime is 60 years old. It is probably the oldest uninterrupted military dictatorship in the world. I think a similar dictatorship would be North Korea, but they didn't come as a result of the coup, the regime there, but as a result of a war. And it's a regime that's non-ideological. It was pro-Western in the very beginning with Nasser, then switched to the Soviets, then back to the Americans with Sadat. It was capitalist turned socialist, so it doesn't have any problem, which explains the rapprochement that happened between the military right after the revolution and the Muslim Brotherhood, because I think for a while they did not mind to have a new Islamist cover until things didn't work between the two, and then the military started to look for another way to survive within this polity. Despite the election, the changes, the authoritarianism of the army, something has changed in Egypt. And what has changed is the army is not the sole political actors as what happened over the last 60 years. Even if the army wants to maintain a certain level of control or protect itself, it became one of the political actors of the Egyptian polity. Today it has to work with Islamists, it has to work with secularists, it has to work with various groups. And we are in a situation in Egypt where no political force can actually monopolize power, and actually no political force also is weak enough to be completely wiped out of the political scene. So the new president will have a tremendous task ahead, because whoever will be elected will have a legitimacy issue. Whether it's Morsi or Shafiq, there is a substantial portion of the population that will reject it and fight it. We have to take in mind a few issues. When we look, for instance, at the politics of the Muslim Brotherhood over the last 15 months, they failed to create any viable coalition. They failed to deliver on the promises that they made, which created fear among some Egyptians. Above all, aligning themselves with the military from the very beginning allowed the military to break the unity of the Egyptian people. And this is what led to a situation where some secularists found themselves forced to support Shafiq of the old regime to counter the Muslim Brotherhood out of fear. Others today fear that Shafiq might try to re-establish the old order. So we have large numbers of secularists who actually boycotted the elections because they're neither happy with Shafiq or with, I even know some Copts who actually boycotted the elections at the risk of seeing an Islamist become president. But this shows the level of, the lack of trust in the upcoming Egyptian president. Do I still have some time? Yeah. Today, this president is going to be elected. I mean, he got elected, but it's going to be announced. It's a president that will be under the authority of the military, even after the official transfer of power in July 1st. The army will legislate, will oversee the budget. He will have no parliament to rule with. He will have no constitution defining his power, even if there was an attempt by the military to try to define these powers in the constitutional declaration. But what we will see, especially if it is Morsi who will be the next president, then we can see that there might be friction between, on one side, between the military and the Muslim Brotherhood, and on the other side, between some of the secularists and Morsi. So it's going to be a very difficult time, because if Morsi becomes president, it means that there will be pressure from the Brotherhood to move towards a presidential system, whereas if it is Shafiq who would win, I think they would pressure more for a parliamentary system. But this, of course, and vice versa. So the country, I think, is moving towards probably more confrontation between all the factions. If the work on the constitution is not done properly in a way that would encompass all the various political actors, then this whole process can be jeopardized by discontent, by protest, by confrontations. With this positive note, but overall, this in the medium term, overall I am optimistic, because things have changed and there are many actors. It's just the way Egyptians are learning centrist politics, and it takes some time to learn that that each side cannot eat the whole pie, but just a slice of it. So this is where we are today.
Very nice try, Kyrie. Oren.
I'm going to, after Khairi's positive notes there, I'm going to add a few of my own. My co-panelists here are both very knowledgeable about Egyptian internal dynamics. I'm going to talk a bit about how things look from the country where I've lived for the past 6.5 years. That's Israel. Of course, there's concern in Israel about what's happening in Egypt. Just this morning, there was an attack on the Egyptian-Israeli border in which one Israeli civilian was killed. This weekend, there were 2 Grad rockets fired from Sinai into Israel. Islamists have taken 3/4 of parliament, though, as Khairi and John mentioned, that parliament has been dissolved. And we may have an Islamist president. All of these are, of course, causes for concern in Israel. I don't think I'm dropping any bombs here when I say that Israeli policymakers would prefer to see Ahmed Shafiq as the next president of Egypt. Shafiq is a military man. He's a man who favors stability. He's not prone to adventurism in diplomacy or military matters. He's well connected in Israel. He said he's the only presidential frontrunner who said he'd be willing to visit Israel. He said he would visit Israel if it's in Egypt's interest. And he's also the only frontrunner who has not called for the Camp David Accords to be revised. And as Shafiq is sort of the epitome of the Egyptian military old guard, it's important to remember that between the upper echelons of the Egyptian and Israeli army, ties really remain quite good. I visited the border region in April, and a top IDF official, an IDF general, told my Israeli colleagues and me that ties with their Egyptian counterparts remain unchanged since the revolution. And as Shafiq is sort of the archetype of the Egyptian military old guard, so Mohammed Morsi is sort of the consummate brotherhood man. In my view, there's not a reformist bone in his body. He's every pound the brotherhood man. And the brotherhood is, as we know, it's an anti-Western organization. It's clearly an anti-Zionist, anti-Israel organization. It's also a deeply anti-Semitic organization. It's an organization that's quite obsessed with Jews, and you see this from its founding in the 1920s. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Brotherhood, was an admirer of Hitler. Sayyid Qutb, the chief ideologue, was an admirer of Hitler. Qutb wrote a famous essay called "Our Struggle with the Jews," in which he sort of blames the Jew. He sees the conflict between Judaism and Islam as having sort of accompanied the birth of Islam, that the Jews supposedly betrayed Muhammad and rejected him, and there's a sort of melding of these sort of Islamic anti-Semitic themes with modern anti-Semitic tropes of the Jews behind communism, capitalism, secularism, sexual freedom, you name it. You see similar sentiments in the Hamas Covenant. Hamas is, of course, essentially the Brotherhood branch in the Palestinian territories. The Covenant blames Jews for the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, both world wars, the fall of the Islamic Caliphate, you name it. And then the founding of Israel is just sort of the latest in this string of Jewish evil deeds. And unfortunately, this sort of sentiment has remained intact until today. Just in April, there was a presidential rally at a Cairo soccer stadium. You can find this on YouTube. And Morsi was sitting there front and center as the MC said, quote, or sort of riled the crowd, saying, "Banished to sleep from the eyes of the Jews. Come on, you lovers of martyrdom, you are all Hamas," which in Arabic incidentally rhymes. And on the practical level, the Brotherhood has said it wants closer ties with Hamas, with Iran, which of course are Israel's most implacable enemies. But even if Shafiq is elected, Israeli policymakers know that the Mubarak era is over. The peace treaty has never been popular. Polls show that about 85% of Egyptians view Israel negatively. 61% want to overturn the treaty entirely. Many more would like to revise it. In Sinai, as I mentioned, Sinai is sort of, if there's one piece of earth that reflects the sort of dramatic changes that Egypt has undergone, it's Sinai. There were the terror attacks I mentioned and the rocket attacks. Last summer there was a large-scale, quite sophisticated terror attack launched from Sinai in which 8 Israelis were killed in southern Israel. And the gas pipeline has been attacked 14 times in as many months. That's the pipeline leading, supplying natural gas from Egypt to Israel. And really, that natural gas trade was really the one sort of significant product of the economic normalization that's envisioned in Camp David. So that deal has been shelved, as John mentioned. Smuggling is also rampant in Sinai, both of people and of goods. The human trafficking from East Africa, which has been going on for years, but it's really accelerated since Mubarak's fall. You've got the Bedouin transporting people from Africa, weapons from Libya. There's a tremendous flow of Libyan weapons going into the Gaza Strip. Cars, really, you name it. It's a free-for-all in Sinai. Now, what can Israel do? It's building the border fence on the border with Sinai that's been in construction for quite some time, but the goal is to have that built by the end of the year. Israel has called up 6 reserve battalions and authorized another 16 amid uncertainty on both the Egyptian and Syrian frontiers. But beyond that, there's really little Israel can do, despite sort of widespread conspiracy theories in Egypt about a hidden Zionist hand behind virtually every development. Israel has very little presence on the ground. It has, the anti-Midas touch. Any party it touches turns to dust. So Israel's watching very carefully, but it knows there's very little ultimately that it can do.
Great, thank you, Oren.
Steve Cook.
Thank you very much. Let me move this closer to me. Good morning, and it's fortuitous that we're here at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies on such a morning, because I think democracy probably needs some defending, given what we're looking at in Egypt. Let me just start by saying that I'm surprised that anybody would think that the events over this weekend, regardless of what the Supreme Constitutional Court did on Thursday or anything that the SCAF did yesterday, would be the beginning of the end of a process of Egypt's transition, or that Egypt would settle down into some sort of normal kind of politics. Egyptians have been, as Khairi observed quite astutely, have been under the yoke of the military for the better part of the last 60 years. It has not been an outright military dictatorship, but it has been a situation of military domination. And as a result, Egyptians in a relatively freer environment have and I don't mean to be facetious here, have a lot of issues that they need to work out. There is an ongoing struggle over a variety of identity issues in Egypt that will not be settled quickly. What kind of government Egyptians want? What is the relationship between religion and the state? What does Egypt stand for? I would submit under the last 30 years, Egypt has come to stand for nothing. And what is Egypt's appropriate place in the region? Is it the primary interlocutor of the West? Is it at peace with Israel, or is it something different? And again, as Khairi pointed out, no one political actor in Egypt, including the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and the Muslim Brotherhood, have enough support or power to impose their will and their vision to the extent they have one on the other. And as a result, they have stalemated and checkmated each other over the course of the last 16 months. To be sure, they have made tactical political deals with each other as their political interests serve, but in the effort to impose their will on the other, they have not been able to do so. The outcome of the presidential election, whatever it is, and when I woke up at 5 o'clock this morning, checked my Twitter feed, the Muslim Brotherhood was celebrating in Tahrir Square, and it seemed that Morsi would eke it out with a 1 to 2% advantage. As I strolled over here, the situation changed. And this is what kind of thing that we can expect in Egypt. Either way, as I started out, whatever the outcome in Egypt, neither is good for democracy, neither is good for the United States, and neither is actually quite good for Israel, given what Oren just said. Let me just start by saying the easy case here is Morsi. The Muslim, I have plenty of colleagues who are convinced that the Muslim Brotherhood is a progressive force for change and democratization. My answer to that is that how do you know, given the fact that they are speaking out of both sides of their mouth on these issues? It is ultimately an empirical question, but certainly their track record thus far is not good. With regard to the United States, the Brotherhood, again, has run against the strategic relationship between the United States and Israel. The Brotherhood are good nationalists, and distrust of foreigners, and in particular Western intervention in Egypt, is part of the movement's DNA. Hassan al-Banna came to Cairo in 1922 and was dismayed by Western penetration of Egypt, and sought to build his organization around reinstilling authentic values, that is not Western values, in Egypt. And as I said before, it's been abundantly clear that the Muslim Brotherhood has sought during the Mubarak era to use the strategic relationship between the United States and Washington to delegitimize Mubarak. What do I say about the United States goes doubly for Israel when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is openly hostile and still trades on the fact that it was the first organization to raise the alarm about the dangers of Zionism to historic Palestine back in the 1930s. We should expect really no kind of change out of Mohamed Morsi presidency with regard to the Brotherhood's hostility to Israel. All that being said, I hardly believe that, and we can get into this in Q&A, I hardly believe that Egypt, under any circumstances, is in any position to actually threaten Israeli security. Let's talk about Shafik for just 1 second. He does have a background that seemingly would make for a happier U.S.-Egypt relationship or a happier Israel-Egypt relationship. But as both Oren and Khairi pointed out, there are new political actors in Egypt now, and politics, even if Shafik comes to power at the behest of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, politics in Egypt has changed radically, and the peace treaty is wildly unpopular. Let me end with 2 points. First, on the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and the constitutional decree of yesterday. This was a bold move, but it was not an entirely surprising move. There is, in fact, historical precedent. Over the course of the last 60 years or so, the Egyptian military has stepped in, whether discreetly or openly, at times of crisis or times of concern, and has overseen the re-engineering of the institutions of the Egyptian state in order to prevent whatever the crisis was from happening again. I think that the decree, got it, I'll be done in less than a minute. I think the decree was also a hedge against a Morsi presidency. Egyptian military officers have said to me that they would never salute a non-nationalist president. That I took that to mean that they would never salute a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. In terms of what we can do about it, what the United States can do about it, my answer is really not much. We don't have a tremendous amount of leverage over any of these actors. Our aid, the leverage we gain from our aid is, I think, half-baked and overblown, and our aid isn't actually worth all that much to many Egyptians anyway. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Terrific. Thank you, Steve. Let me just start by asking Steve and Kyrie. I mean, what happened to the SCAF alliance of convenience with the Brotherhood? I mean, my impression is, beginning with putting forward the candidacy of Shafiq, whenever that was, in April or May, there has, including this weekend's, culminating in this weekend's events, they really went on the offensive from a group that seemed at the beginning of the revolution to want to, as quickly as possible, pass the chalice of at least the veneer of power onto somebody else, into what looked like a pretty naked grab to protect the old order, come what may. How do you assess what actually happened and what triggered this major offensive by the SCAF?
From the very beginning, right after the departure of Mubarak, the transition was designed in a way that seemed suspicious to many Egyptians. First, there was a commission who was tasked to make some constitutional amendments or to design the transition. And most of the experts of this commission were either Muslim Brotherhood members or sympathizers, which seemed very suspicious to all the other political forces. Afterwards, there was calls from all the political forces, with the exception of the Islamists, to first sit down and draft a constitution, and after that we can speak of elections after a transition period that would level the ground. It seems that the military underestimated, I think, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Egyptian street by trying to set up a scenario in which they would design it in a way that would be favorable to the Muslim Brotherhood, and we have seen the Muslim Brotherhood win legislative elections. But the Muslim Brotherhood, from the very beginning, they said that they would not run a presidential candidate, they will not dominate parliament, that they will only run 30%, over 30% of the seats, they will not dominate the Constituent Assembly. So everything, I think, went fairly smooth, and the Muslim Brotherhood rubber-stamped whatever the military wanted to do by appointing the cabinet of Kamal Ganzouri, and until probably the military realized that the Muslim Brotherhood wanted more than what it claimed in the beginning. So we saw it dominate the parliament, which is, I mean, there is nothing wrong with running candidates in all the districts, but be upfront from the beginning. And then attempts at dominating the Constituent Assembly, and finally with the presidential candidate. So I think the military establishment felt threatened, and this is where it wanted to play another game, such as, not a game, other move. And we have seen the Muslim Brotherhood mobilize and try to show that it has a popular mandate. Now, when we look at the dissolution of the parliament, and many see it as a coup against the democratic order, well, the dissolution of the parliament was, it's on the same ground that dissolved the parliament of 1984 and 1987, even if, like today, judges, some of the judges were appointed by Mubarak, and even if the parliaments were dominated by Mubarak, but still on the same ground. So wittingly or unwittingly, the military created a transition and an electoral law with a defect. Maybe if they would have still had good relations with the Muslim Brotherhood, we wouldn't have this court ruling. Also, there is another mistake, I believe, that the Muslim Brotherhood did, is that it tried to play with the judiciary, with the laws regarding the judiciary in Parliament. And the judiciary felt threatened, and maybe this was an incentive to actually dig and look what is legal and what is illegal. But even with the dissolution of Parliament, there will be other elections, and I doubt that, I mean, whoever wins, or despite the might of the military, that they can rig the elections the same day of the Mubarak era. Sorry, that was...
Let me just add quickly. I think, John, to your question, I think the military does still want to give up power. They don't want to be in the position of administrating the Egyptian state. They've proven themselves to be very bad at it, and it's not part of their historical narrative that they should be doing it. They haven't been doing it since 1967 or early 1968. And I think if you look at the sequence of the transition, it suggested that they wanted to hand power over to whomever they could negotiate a deal with. And they just haven't found anyone to make that deal. And that deal was the military gets to keep its economic interests, it gets to remain the locus of power, authority, and legitimacy in the political system, and it has a certain conception of what Egyptian stability would look like. Nobody was willing to get that because the officers, they are not evil geniuses, don't have a perfect theory of politics, didn't realize, because they were the only ones who were behaving normally, that everybody else, given the changes resulting from the transition, were not behaving as they expected. So whereas they expected the Brotherhood to not directly confront the state, when the power was within the Muslim Brotherhood's grasp, they went back on everything that they said that they would. And this is their hedge against, as I said before, saluting a non-nationalist officer.
But, I mean, so this, I mean, leads me to wonder that, I mean, you've actually cut to the core of a very, very serious conflict here where sort of everybody's true interests have been exposed. The Brotherhood, much more ambitious than anybody would have thought. They want power. They want to have the state under their control. They want to cut the military down to size. They want something that begins to look like a Sharia-led state. And the military is against all of that. The military is for its power. It's basically for the old regime. I mean, so that my question is, how does this play out? This is a genuine head-on-head clash, and it's hard for me to see then, having given the experience of the last 16 months, to see where interests will overlap sufficiently to allow us to reach some kind of new normal in Egypt.
For a long time, especially outside Egypt, the assumption was that the Egyptian polity contained two political actors, the military and the Islamists. Then we had the Arab Spring that proved that most people are neither Islamist nor secularist. Most people are, in fact, non-ideological. Then we had in Egypt the legislative elections that brought Islamists, that give them a two-third majority. But if we look closer, we see that the context and the conditions were favorable. Then we have the presidential elections, the first round, that showed that, in fact, non-Islamist candidate got more votes than Islamist candidate. And now we have the second round, in which, of course, Islamists gave the maximum they can give, and it's about 50% to Morsi, and then elements of the old regime and some secularists and some Copts gave Shafiq, and it's also a small number, which shows that the Egyptian polity is much more diverse than what we have thought in the beginning, and that there are many political actors, and it's only a pluralistic democratic constitution that can contain all these different elements. And when we look from Washington at policies towards Egypt, I think we should forget this assumption of either the military or the Islamists. And this was what Mubarak was using. And to look at the multitude of actors and to work with all these actors. And when we say, how can we help Egypt, we should not help one party or one group or one individual, but we should support a process. And this process, it's the establishment of a democratic order. That's why we get back to the issue of the constitution, a constitution that would be fair to all and that would protect everybody. Because betting on the military or the Islamists, I think it's betting on two minority groups, and it's not betting on stability. So it is a new political orders. We will see what will happen in the coming weeks. There are already some parties that created a front right now to counter whoever wins. I think over the next few weeks we will see a new group forming and a new dynamic, and we will see if the Muslim Brotherhood will be able to be more inclusive. And so that's why I think the Constitution will be the test.
Let me just add quickly. I'm glad that Khairi mentioned that this narrative about the Brotherhood versus the military is essentially a false one. It was one of the inspirations for my book that, John, you were nice enough to mention. That being said, and we've seen that over the course of the last 16 months, and if you looked hard enough before the uprising, you could see a ideologically rich environment, a contested political environment with liberals, nationalists, left, Nasrists, everybody involved in debates and discussions. But we can't ignore what's now been set up and how it's happened. And that is, we have the Brotherhood that is making a bid for power, and the military, seemingly by this decree that it issued yesterday and other things that have happened over the course of the last few weeks, not willing to let that happen. As I said in my opening remarks, neither of these groups have the ability to impose their will on the other. The military has a lot of coercion, but not a lot of vision. The Brotherhood has a lot of vision that people respond to, but not a lot of coercion to impose its will on the military. And you have essentially a checkmate. And this will continue to produce the uncertainty marked by periodic spasms of instability that we have seen in Egypt over the course of the last 16 months, with this amalgamation of liberals, nationalists, leftists, and Nasrists working through fronts and in cooperation trying to move the two big kids on the block into some box where they can realize their ultimate goals.
I had mentioned in my remarks that as all of this is happening, and it sounds like, I'm not sure if you're predicting kind of stasis where we have sort of ongoing periodic crises, but basically Egypt lumbers along in this state of. In the meantime, as I mentioned, and particularly the economy continues to be in very, very serious trouble. You do have this problem with these increasingly ungovernable spaces, rising crime, even some areas of rising disease, foot and mouth disease spreading like wildfire. Is that what do we need not really to worry too much that Egypt is going to be really very, very self-consumed trying to work out its internal matter, but there's not going to be a steep deterioration from what we've become accustomed to over the last 15 or 16 months? Is that what we're looking at?
I think we're welcome to the new normal. Obviously things can get worse. There was some sense that tourism was picking up again. I can't imagine that this situation is going to help the tourism sector. And as you pointed out, there are a whole host of below-the-radar screen issues beyond the kind of major political questions that are kind of eating Egypt from within. I think that Egypt is a very leaky boat that no one's going to let it sink. Certainly not going to let the economy collapse. Where the money will come from, I'm not quite sure. But Egypt is too important. It is too big to fail in a lot of ways. I didn't mean to say that. But I think we will see Egypt lumber from one crisis to the next, and we will see continued instability there.
Economically, the regime has been dealing for the last 16 months by some sort of crisis management, but the last couple of months, for the first time, there was an increase in the foreign reserves in Egypt by about $200 million. which is considered to be a great achievement, all things considered. But of course, the economy is a very big problem. Egypt is the largest importer of wheat in the world, and if any import of wheat is delayed, and then that can mean another new revolution. And also, yes, crisis management and where the money would come from. You know, they're trying with the IMF, with the World Bank, with the Gulf countries. The thing is, whoever will win or whoever runs the country cannot isolate the country from the rest of the world, because Egypt is not Iran with its whole revenue, and so the country will need the partners for its economy. And also with a population of 85 million, I don't think that Egypt can have one patron that will subsidize it, I would say, the way it's done with, for instance, Hamas and the Palestinians. So that's why it's a double-edged sword, because in a way it makes things very difficult economically. In another way, it means that Egypt will need cooperation with many countries, and usually when you need cooperation, then you cannot go fight the entire world. But there is also another element, is that when we looked at legislative elections, for instance, or presidential elections, we find that the economic programs of most candidates are similar. And it's a mixture of some free markets with some socialist elements, such as everybody's scared of tackling the issue of subsidies, which is a big problem in Egypt, and also whether to continue privatization or not continue. So it's all everybody wants to be free market and socialist at the same time, and so I don't know exactly how this is going to work out.